Welcome to the regularly scheduled meeting of the Economic Development and Regulatory Services Committee. Our committee has a quorum today, and we've been joined by council members Cano, Fletcher, Ellison, and Cunningham, which is a quorum of the committee. We're going to start with item number 1, which is one of 2 public hearings. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first application today is an application for a new proprietor for a banquet facility in the Midtown Phillips neighborhood, Ward 9. It's known as Jigga Business Center, LLC, doing business as Jigga Event Center at 1516 East Lake, and they are seeking a rental hall license. This location has twice previously been a rental hall. It is owned by Kadar Aden, and he is the 100% owner and manager. They wish to serve the community as a place with the rental hall license to hold, serve the community as a place to hold meetings, weddings, political fundraisers, and more. This rental hall application does require that we hold a public hearing today. We notified all residents and property owners within 300 feet of the premises of today's public hearing. We also notified the Midtown Phillips Neighborhood Association and the Lake Street Council. We received 2 responses from that mailing process. One was in support from the Lake Street Council, and one was opposed. The opposed one was concerned about the condition of the landscaping in the parking lot. And as weather permits this spring, we will do a thorough review of the parking lot to make sure that they're in compliance with their approved site plan. Staff's recommendation is that the application be approved.
Are there any questions for Mr. Wilson on item number 1? Seeing none, we'll open the public hearing on item number 1, which is a license application for the Jigga Event Center. Is there? I don't see Mr. Khan here, and I know him. Is there anyone here to speak to this issue? Anyone? Anyone? Seeing none, I'll move approval of item number 1. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item has been approved. On to item number 2. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our next application is by the Canopy Restaurant, and they wish to extend their operating hours to 11 p.m. Sunday through Thursday until 2 a.m. on Friday and Saturday. This application also includes an application for a place of entertainment license for their banquet operation. They are located at 312 West Lake Street, and their current authorized hours of operation are from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. and Friday and Saturday until 11 p.m. They will operate their place of entertainment with extended hours using licensed private security companies, and they plan to feature their facility for weddings, birthday parties, community events, etc. Their security plan was reviewed by 5th Precinct Commander Inspector Kathy Waite, and they have indicated that they have now have video surveillance cameras in their facility. A public hearing is required for this extended hours license. We notified all residents and property owners within 300 feet of the facility, and also notified the Whittier Neighborhood Association and the Lake Street Council. We received no responses from that notification process, and staff's recommendation is the application be approved.
Are there any questions for Mr. Wilson on item number 2? Seeing none, we'll open the public hearing on item number 2, which is an extended hours license for the Canopy Restaurant. Is there anyone here to speak to this issue? Please step forward, state your name and address for the record, sir.
Yeah, my name is Liban Mohammed. My mother and I are 50% owners. And you want my address or the address of the establishment?
Either one.
Okay, it's 3112 West Lake Street in Minneapolis, Minnesota, 55408.
And do you want to tell us about what you're doing?
Yes, we're going to have events and weddings and birthday parties and whatnot. And we're going to try to provide those services to the community.
Well, thank you very much for being here today and for doing business in the city. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you for seeing me, guys.
Thank you for being here. Is there anyone else here to speak to this issue? Anyone? Please step forward and state your name and address for the record, ma'am.
My name is Anab Aiden, and I heard it's Friday and Saturday, and if you don't mind, on Sunday also, on extended hours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to this issue? Anyone? Anyone? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Councilmember Fletcher.
Move approval.
Approval of item number 2 has been moved. Further comments or questions? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item is approved. We'll then move on to item number 3, which is our rental license revocation. Mr. Moreno, thank you for being here today.
Good afternoon, Chair Goodman and committee members. I'm Nick Magrino from Regulatory Services. The property involved in this action is 3546 Humboldt Avenue North, a single-family home operated as a rental property. The respondent in this matter, Al Sessler, is the owner of record and obtained a license to operate the property as a rental business in May of 2013. In April 2014, housing inspections conducted an initial rental licensing inspection at the property, and the housing inspector at that time spoke to the property manager and stated that the second floor could not be used as a bedroom due to the lack of required ceiling height and egress. In August 2014, the inspector conducted a reinspection for unrelated outstanding orders and found that the second floor was still being used as a bedroom. This resulted in a written notice of ordinance code violations. Notices were sent to Mr. Sessler's stated rental contact, Brenton Hayden, at 6101 Baker Road in Minnetonka in September of 2014. And a reinspection in November of 2014 found that the second floor was still being used as a bedroom. In January of 2015, an administrative citation was issued for the ceiling height and egress issue, and a director's determination of noncompliance was issued to the owner and property manager, giving them 10 days to bring the property into compliance. A reinspection in February 2015 found that the second floor was no longer being used as a bedroom. In August 2017, an inspection was conducted at the property which found that the second floor was again being used as a bedroom and still did not have the required ceiling height and egress. A notice of unlawful occupancy was sent to Mr. Sessler and the property was placarded as such. Minneapolis Code of Ordinances 244-1910, our licensing standards, state in subdivision 3 that no rental dwelling or rental unit shall be overoccupied or illegally occupied in violation of the Housing Maintenance Code. Minneapolis Code of Ordinances 244-1940 further requires that a second violation of subdivision 3 for illegal occupancy initiates the rental license revocation process. A notice of revocation was sent to Mr. Sessler at 5730 Aldrich Avenue North in Brooklyn Center on September 5th, 2017, and Mr. Sessler filed an appeal. The hearing was scheduled for December 18th, 2017, and Mr. Sessler failed to appear at that hearing. Administrative Hearing Officer Fabian Hoffner elected to continue the hearing to a later date, and it was continued to January 11th, 2018, where Mr. Sessler did appear. After taking testimony from both parties, Mr. Hoffner recommended the revocation of the license. And I'll also note that the owner has a history of failing to appear at the property for required inspections, and there are also still a number of outstanding orders from the initial 2014 inspection for repairs in the kitchen, to the windows, to an exterior door, and a lack of required screens at the property. And so the city is requesting revocation of the license, and I'm happy to stand for any questions that you might have.
Are there any questions for Mr. Magrino on his report or anything in the packet that we've received? Seeing none, thank you very much for your report. I'd first like to ask if Mr. Sessler is here, if Mr. Sessler or any of his representatives are here. Okay. Mr. Fussy, do you want me just simply to open and close the public hearing then?
Madam Chair, I believe it would be appropriate simply to call for Mr. Sessler as representative, and if they do not appear, to close the hearing and entertain a motion.
Okay, I'll open the public hearing on item number 3, which is a license revocation at 3546 Humboldt Avenue North. Is there anyone here to speak to this issue, or is Mr. Sessler or his representative here to speak to this issue today? Anyone? Anyone? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and call on Councilmember Cunningham.
I would like to make the motion for the revocation of this rental license.
A motion has been made to approve the staff recommendation. Further comments or questions? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item is approved. Thank you for being here today. We'll move then on to our consent agenda, which are items 4, which are the regular liquor business and gambling licenses, as well as item number 5, which are a number of non-public hearing related approvals for the Cannaby restaurant that we approved in item number 2. Prior to moving approval of those 2 items, Councilmember Palmisano has joined us, and I wanted to give her an opportunity to speak to an item in her ward. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to speak briefly to one of these licenses. It would be a beer and wine license for Penny's Coffee that I hope you will choose to approve today. I want to point out that we have received over 27 pages of feedback, written feedback to the city on this issue. We also had a neighborhood hearing on this issue, and it really gave a positive opportunity for neighbors to come and neighboring business owners to come and really directly address the business operator and ask for things that have been causing them stress. With the help of their business consultant, Jerry Wolf, I'm proud to say that we've been able to get them to agree to a new business plan. It helps with some of these nuisance issues. It helps with minimizing some disturbances, some signage and reminders and issues about animals and pet waste. So business plans are enforceable under city ordinances, and their plans do not mean changing into an expanded menu, happy hours, or a full service restaurant. So I'm confident that that was a productive conversation, and I wanted to just share with you some of that really good neighborhood process that was put in place under this specific restaurants' application today. Thank you.
Thank you for being here today, and thank you for also bringing up an item of note, which is that some of the public hearings on liquor and business license applications happen in neighborhoods, and some of them happen here at the council chambers. Council members generally decide with staff on their own, not with my guidance, where they'd like to have the neighborhood, where they'd like to have the public hearing. Councilmember Palmisano determined to have that in the neighborhood, probably at night, I would guess. And I think that was a very good outcome rather than having everyone come down today. So I want to thank you for that work and for getting us to this point. I'm going to move the consent agenda then, which are items 4 and 5. Is there further comments or questions on either item? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Those items are approved. We'll move on to our remaining item, which is item number 6. Mr. Carroll, welcome.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Kevin Carroll. I work in the Business Development Division of CPED. I have a staff report here for you today regarding the approval and acceptance of the grants that were awarded by our 3 local Brownfield grantors in the fall 2017 grant round. That grant round had a November 1 application deadline. The grantors made their decisions in the late December to mid-January range. All of these grants require formal action by the City Council to accept and approve the grants. I know that for several of you, you haven't been exposed to Brownfield grant issues before. If you'd like, I could give a brief explanation of the process.
I think that that would be helpful, and it would also be helpful for you to let us know in this round, did every application that was submitted on behalf of the city projects get approved?
No, but most of them did. It was a highly competitive grant round. All these grant programs are grossly oversubscribed in every round. A little bit of background, Brownfield is kind of a term of art. The EPA defines a brownfield as a site that is either known to be contaminated or suspected of being contaminated. 3 local grantors developed their program starting in probably the mid-1990s, and I think the most recent one was the Hennepin County ERF program, which I think was started maybe around in the early 2000s. The state of Minnesota program is administered by DEED, the Department of Employment and Economic Development. The Met Council's grant program is called the Tax Base Revitalization Account. Hennepin County's program is called the Environmental Response Fund. Years ago, they coordinated their grant programs so they have the same application deadlines. They have 2 rounds per year. They have 1 round of applications in May 1, and the other round has applications due in November 1. They're called the spring and fall grant rounds. This was the fall round. All the grantors require that the applications actually come from another governmental entity. If you're a developer or property owner, in most cases, you can't apply directly for these funds. So our process involves them giving pre-applications to us that let us know what the project is going to be. They let us know how much money they want to ask for and who they're going to ask that money for from. Then we review them. We make recommendations to the council. In this particular round, we did that, I think, back in probably October. We have to do that because when the applications go in on November 1, they have to be accompanied by a city council resolution of support. All of these grantors want to know that the city in which the property is located supports the decision to seek grant funding. The grantors then review the applications. They each have their own scoring and ranking criteria. They decide which projects to award grants to. City Minneapolis projects are eligible under all these programs, but there are limitations in some cases on the amount of grant funding we can get, which is part of the reason some projects don't get funded. For example, the Met Council's program has a statutory limitation that no city can get more than 50% of the available funding. In this round, I think 8 of the 9 city projects that submitted applications got Met Council TBRA funding. The one that didn't get funded because it was, if they had funded that, it would have been over the 50% threshold.
Which project was that?
I don't recall, frankly. I can check on that and get back to you. The other reasons we don't get grants sometimes is because DEED, for example, is a statewide program. They have a statutory requirement that 35% of the available grant funding go to Greater Minnesota projects if they get enough applications. If they don't, they can award more money to metro area applications. Hennepin County similarly has a rough rule of thumb. They try to award 50% of the available funding to suburban applications, 50% to Minneapolis applications, again, if they get enough applications. If they don't get enough applications from the suburbs, then they can award more money to Minneapolis projects. So there are these ceilings on how much money we can get. We did get a total of $3.5 million in this grant round. Between this grant round and the spring 2017 round, we got a total of about $8.5 million in grant funding for Minneapolis projects. That's pretty consistent over the last couple of years. We've averaged somewhere between $8 and $9 million a year in grant funding. We've built that up from 10 or 15 years ago. We were getting probably $3 to $4 million a year. So we've made some process improvements over time, and we've been more aggressive about marketing the availability of the funding to developers. We've held informational meetings, done outreach, et cetera. So we often submit many more applications to the grantors than they have funding for. But part of the reason we do that is because in many cases, whatever amount of money they start out saying they have available, in the end, they sometimes have more money available because some of the other grant programs are undersubscribed. They don't get enough applications, so they then shift money back into the Brownfield grant programs. I've had the good fortune to do this work for the city since early 2007. And during that span of time, we've had about $89 million worth of Brownfield grant funding awarded. It's something that kind of flies below the radar. A lot of people don't pay much attention to it, but it is critically important. Most lenders will not provide construction or permanent financing on a contaminated site. And they also won't loan money to clean up a contaminated site. So many of these projects depend very heavily on grant funding to get the site investigated and then cleaned up so the property is eligible for construction financing. So it's we leverage the Brownfield grant funding, and many of these projects are well over $100 million projects. The money can be used for certain types of contamination. The more common types are soil contamination. Sometimes there's groundwater contamination. There are vapors that sometimes come up through the soil from off-site sources, so the money can be used for the installation of vapor barriers to protect the owners and inhabitants of those buildings. Also, many Minneapolis older buildings are redeveloped, and many of them have asbestos and lead-based paint in them. So the money can be used to investigate those contaminants and to use the money to clean them up.
So I foresee a robust conversation about this. So perhaps we have worked together for many years, and I have always brought up the same issue year after year. And I think my thinking has shifted on it. I used to think we should make sure that projects that are priorities of the city get funded by ranking them. And then we were told you can't rank them. And so I kind of shut up on that because we couldn't rank them, and we kind of rolled the dice to see that projects that were priorities of the city got funded, and many of the times they did and sometimes they didn't. Now my thinking is, why would we agree to put a project on this list if it doesn't directly achieve city goals? For example, why would we have a project on the list to get public funds that has no affordable housing in it if it was a housing project? I don't know why we would do that. Would they just go to, if we said no to Azine Alley, which is 70 luxury condos and a hotel, they just go to Hennepin County and have them be the grantor? I mean, or would they would not apply for the money and other more worthy projects that had affordable housing in them would get funded?
Well, they couldn't apply to any of these grantors directly. If they don't get a city council resolution support, they couldn't apply to any of the grantors. So the Brownfield grant funding would not be an option for them.
So shouldn't it not be an option for them if they're not meeting our affordable housing goals?
We could certainly discuss that. All the grantors give priority to affordable housing projects. If you have a market rate project that's competing against an affordable housing project, all other things being equal, the affordable housing project will be scored higher. The grantors don't eliminate market rate projects from consideration. Part of their thinking is that even a purely market rate project creates new market value, new tax value, which generates revenue for the city of Minneapolis, for the state of Minnesota, for the Met Council. So they see value to those projects. In addition, many of the projects that don't have affordable components still have other interesting aspects to them. Maybe they're on a transit-oriented corridor. They're providing housing for people that can get in and out of town on the light rail instead of driving their cars. So they have ranking and scoring systems, and I think in virtually every round, at least some projects that have no affordable housing get funded. And if you as a council decide that you don't want us to submit applications for a project that has no affordable housing, obviously we won't do it. We've done it in the past because, we've looked at these projects and we've considered them eligible for funding. They meet the grantor's requirements. And our thinking is that for every market rate project we take out of the running, it's less grant money that's coming to the city of Minneapolis to help build up the tax base.
Okay, so Councilmember Gordon.
So it's interesting to hear that there's a scoring process anyway, so that the projects get scored by the three granting agencies. Do you think that means that the one that didn't get funded this time didn't have affordable housing or wasn't? I mean, I guess I'm curious about, or I would be concerned if it looked like a project that the city council would say, this is a higher priority for us, we want to make sure this gets funded, got bumped out of the way for something that we said, we think the market should do that on its own or whatever. And I know you're not recalling what that project is, so you probably can't even speculate whether or not it had affordable housing as part of it.
Yeah.
But it might be helpful for us to get to know some of the criteria, or even outside of the meeting, get to see what is some of the scoring criteria used by these agencies to get a better understanding of it.
I could certainly provide you with that information. They make their score sheets and their applications available online. So, sometimes we take a little stab at scoring them ourselves to see how the grantors would score them.
Do you think that, then I'll ask this other question, and it's pretty much subjective, but if we made somehow it a requirement to do something, meet some criteria of ours, some added additional criteria just to get on the list, do you think that would have any impact for these projects? For example, if we said, to get on our list, you need to have at least some affordability, or you need to at least have some job creation potential here. Do you think people would add those into their projects?
Hard to say. It kind of depends on how critical the Brownfield grant funding is to them. Some projects say this project is not going to happen without it. Other projects say the project might happen, but we're going to have to scale back on other things that would be attractive elements that the city might want in order to make up for the loss of the Brownfield grant funding. And some projects would prefer to get the money, but the projects are going to go ahead anyway. Frankly, I do see that from time to time. There are some projects that don't get any funding and they figure out a way to make it work. So I think there may be some projects that do that. And we do have the right, you have the right to impose requirements on these projects. For example, at a staff level, a number of years ago, we were occasionally sending projects to the grantors that we thought were ready for funding, and they ended up not being ready. So we adopted a staff form called a grant assessment worksheet, and we require people to do that. We've done it for years, and we've broken down project readiness criteria. Do they own the site outright? If not, do they have a signed purchase agreement? That's a prerequisite. If someone comes to us and says, we have a letter of intent, or we're interested in possibly buying this property, we tell them that's not eligible. We won't even submit it to you for consideration because the grantors will not award a grant to a property like that. So we set criteria. We look at financing, we look at neighborhood engagement, We always encourage them to go to the council member for the affected ward and talk about the project so that you don't hear about it for the first time when I'm standing up here telling you about it. We look at the status of the land use approvals. Have they applied for land use approvals? If they've applied but they haven't been awarded yet or approved, what's the planning staff's position on it? Is it something that's likely to be approved? So we already impose a lot of requirements in order to get through the staff review and to get to you. If you want to give us more direction as to projects that you don't want to see because they don't have certain elements, we will do that.
So,
I guess I'm interested in that, and it would be interesting to see what your recommendations would be. I don't know if I'm saying that I'm ready to say I don't want to see them, but it might be interesting to review kind of how they scored or the criteria, and hear more about that as we made the decisions.
I did cross-reference the staff report, which has a list of the Met Council TBRA grants with my summary of the original pre-applications that we got. And it looks like the project that didn't get funded was the Hook and Ladder project. And the Hook and Ladder project does have some affordable housing units. And the reason it scored higher than projects from other jurisdictions that got funded simply because we reached that threshold level and got cut off.
right, so 2 projects that are luxury rental got funded and that one didn't. So there was an outcome. Maybe it was only on one project, but there was an outcome where affordable housing didn't get the money they needed and market rate housing did. I do think, and I'm going to let Councilmember Cunningham speak as well, I don't think we're prepared to make a decision from the dais. I think it's something worth discussing with staff. And, you know, just to have a more, we're going to accept these grants, obviously. We're not going to say we don't want the money. But I do think it's something worth looking at as we look at every tool in our toolbox to encourage affordable housing development. Any public funding going out should meet that criteria. The governor's got a task force on affordable housing. Everyone is talking about affordable housing. That might be a screen. Not likely for economic development projects. I would argue the Innovation District project that John Wall is doing, we don't know what that's even going to be. It needs environmental just to get to figure out what it is. Mm-hmm. It's clearly a commercial development option. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is more of a comment than a question, but I just wanted to also add my voice to the concern about public dollars going towards private market rate development. And really because of the fact that the city has that mechanism, like the developers have to come to the city in order to access those dollars. And so I want to make sure that in this conversation that we are talking about how we are much like what was said is every mechanism that we have to be leveraging that so that we are following through with our goals. Every council member, the mayor, folks everywhere are talking about affordable housing. So I want to make sure that we are being intentional about public dollars going into affordable housing and not just something like an 8-story hotel with 70 market rate or luxury units. So, thank you.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thanks very much. I think it's worth thinking about too in terms of our staff processes as we start to look at this. To what extent are we identifying the projects in our conversations about this internally as we're thinking about these projects, where we've applied for public funding or where we've attempted to access public funding for them? I think many of us, I think our constituents expect us as stewards of public money to hold that money accountable to supporting affordable housing as one of the major criteria that we're looking at. And I think in a lot of the projects I'm realizing as they've been presented to us, I'm not necessarily sure that I would know just in the way that the conversation's happening with staff today, whether we've applied for funding. There's a lot of different lists of a lot of different resolutions that we've passed for a bunch of different funding sources. So I wonder if it's worth just as an internal practice for all of us starting to identify the places that we've sought funding so that we know where there needs to be accountability attached to that. I think that's one of the things that I would look for moving forward as part of this sort of staff work.
It'd be easy to put that in staff reports. I mean, in the narrative descriptions we put in there, we do identify whether it's market rate or affordable, but we could summarize that in a table to make it more digestible and accessible.
Yeah, and there is superb staff work on this. It's a lot of work to coordinate all of this in the process. Mr. Carroll's been doing it for a really long time, and he's never said no. I drive him crazy all the time, so I know that he's never said no, we're not doing it your way or the committee's way, and that's exactly what you're saying here today. I think what we're saying is we'd like to look at that.
Sure.
And we hope you would, join us in wanting to look at that and seeing if we can just do the process a little bit better. You get what you get without policy direction to say we don't want to do this. Your job is to get as much money for projects in the city as possible, and you've been tremendously successful at that since you took over this program. So we'd like to work with you. We'll figure we're going to accept these grants and try this in the next round, and maybe we try it for 2 rounds and see what happens. If we're just leaving a lot of money on the table, we might want to rethink it. So I don't want that to happen. I certainly don't want to be in a situation where we're eligible. We don't submit any market rate projects and we end up getting $1 million. I just don't want the affordable ones to not get funded over market rate projects because someone can go lobby DEED or the Met Council. They have more resources, although these affordable housing developers are pretty good lobbyists themselves. But it does seem to me that we would want to have as much money going into the projects that are living wage job creation and affordable housing than anything else.
Something I will promise you that I will do, because I'm curious about it now, is to go back a couple rounds and just see, have there been any projects with affordable housing that did not get any grant funding? The Hook and Ladder project was in a prior round and I think got at least 2 grants, and they got a substantial amount of the funding that they needed. They got into this additional round because they had a little bit of a shortfall, because I think one of the grants they applied for they didn't get, so they were taking a second run at it. So I would be surprised if there are very many affordable housing projects that did not get at least some funding. But I think that's information that you probably want to know, and frankly, I want to know it too.
And we probably also want to know if we say we're not going to fund your project because you don't have affordable housing in it, if that would gain the support of developers adding even 5 units in order to apply for the grant. I mean, would it move the dial at all? We're not saying they have to put 20% in. We're saying, can you put in 5 units? Can you take 6 Section 8 units? Can you do something in order to be eligible for sources of public funding? So there might be some, it's a persuasion approach more than anything else rather than a mandate. I don't want to set up a mandate, but I do want to try to get them to see this contribution as something that we would like to get something back for in the term of meeting the city's housing goals.
For what it's worth, they're already doing that to a large extent because of the grantor scoring. I mean, I've seen some projects come in and give us a pre-application with all market rate units. And as I talk with them about how projects are ranked and scored, and they know they get extra points for affordable housing, then they come back and suddenly they got 20% affordable to 30%. So they're doing it in response to what the grantors do, but that doesn't mean they couldn't also do it in response to what we do.
Yeah, I've never seen a project where they've come in and said, we're doing a market rate project, now we're going to do affordable, because the problem we have in the city from where I sit is that it's all one or the other. It's 100% affordable, so it's a concentration of poverty in some locations, even though it's building or new construction, or it's all market rate. And I think what most of us would say, and there would be agreement on, is that we want to see mixed income housing. So we want to go back to the time when 5, 10, 15, 20% are actually affordable mixed throughout a project. And it's rare the project that just adds 20%. I have a couple in my ward, they were done long ago. So I'm hoping that we can maybe use the leverage we have in this process to encourage a little give here and there. For $500,000, you think that they could add 5 units. 5 is better than 0. And that would be moving the dial for 5 families at a time. Councilmember, oh, now everyone's up. Okay, let's see. Who really wants to talk? Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to get some clarity on the city's ability to rank these projects. I know that through conversations with Councilmember Goodman that our previous opinion has been that the grantees don't care about our rankings and don't want to hear them. But since affordable housing has been sort of the priority, at least in this last election cycle, in quoting the mayor, we've lost what was it, 10,000 affordable units in the last 10 years. I can't help but notice, but that kind of matches up with, your timeline. Like, not that I'm blaming anything on you, but like I'm listening to that number of $89 million in the last 10 years and thinking, okay, how much, maybe cycle by cycle, it's not a large sum of money, but over the long haul, what could $89 million done to help really support affordable housing in the city? And so, have we tried to rank projects in the past? And if we haven't, what could it hurt to do so?
When I first started doing this work in late December of 2006, that fall 2006 round was just ending. So then early in 2007, I was working on that was the first full round I was involved in. And at that time, we did have a process. There was a separate form that we used, which is kind of like our current grant assessment worksheet. And we gathered information about the projects, and there was a staff committee that spent a lot of time looking at them and ranking them. And then we gave the grantors those rankings. And that was one of the first questions I asked to the grantors, because I just didn't know. I said, what do you do with these rankings? And all three of them said nothing. We glanced at them, we set them aside, but it has no impact on what we do. And I said, well, why is that? Why don't you care, what the city of Minneapolis wants? And they say, well, we care. Our view is that when you make the sort of binary toggle switch decision to submit it or not submit it, if you submit it to us, you're saying that you're prepared to have us fund it. And if you don't want us to fund it, then don't submit it to us. So I made the recommendation to the council and this committee, I think at the time, to dispense with the ranking, because we're spending a lot of time on it and it wasn't accomplishing anything. And in fairness to the grantors, they say it's our money. We have the right to decide, who we're going to award it to and the criteria we're going to use to make those decisions. And you don't want to argue with them because they've got the money. So that's why we stopped doing it. We could start ranking them again. And if we did that, we would probably come to you with a list and say, this is the staff ranking. We're prepared to submit all of these because we think they're all eligible and worthwhile. If you want to start crossing them off at the bottom, that's certainly your prerogative. And you're going to have a chance to do that sooner rather than later, because March 9 is the pre-application deadline for this year's spring round. Mm-hmm. And I'll be back in front of you on April 17th with staff recommendations regarding that round. So that would be your first opportunity to do that if you want to do that. And I'll do my best to incorporate your guidance into the process that occurs from now until April 17, or when the staff report is written, which is, mid-March. So that's a long answer to a short question, but
it's a helpful answer. Thank you.
All right.
Councilmember Gordon, followed by Councilmember Fletcher.
So I actually do have, I think, more appetite than the committee chair for some kind of required affordable housing, some kind of inclusionary zoning. This a little bit is touching that, calling the question on that, but it also occurred to me that it might be worth exploring if we had the legal authority to just blanketly say, if you take any public money, then you're going to be required to do these few things. And I think that might change the dynamic a little, to think about somebody taking public money, whether or not it's from the city or elsewhere. Okay, now the lever's just been switched, and you've just then made this commitment to comply with some other requirements of ours, including perhaps a certain percentage of affordable housing based on how many units you're building or something. And I think that's an intriguing concept that I'm going to meditate on in the days ahead.
Yeah, I don't mind saying that to be on our list, you have to have affordable housing. I just don't think from the dais right now we can say how much, with what exception, under what circumstances, because we haven't had an opportunity to talk in any kind of work group with staff about it. I was ready to do that 3 years ago. So, I think it's outrageous that any public money would go to a project and there would be nothing required in return other than building on a surface parking lot, which I think is good, but I still think we should be requiring something. So I don't object to that. I just don't think we could sit up here right now and formulate what the requirement would be. And so I think the best thing to do after Councilmember Fletcher speaks is just to give a staff direction, to give us a sense of what how would Kevin formulate this? What are your thoughts? And we can talk about it in committee and have it in place for the spring round. Councilmember Fletcher.
All right. Just a brief comment and then a question. So you mentioned that it hasn't happened often to have something start off as market and then get some affordable. So I just want to give credit where it's due that Marcy Holmes did manage to apply a little bit of pressure and get the Pillsbury Research Center site and Kelly Doran's project over there to include, I think, 10 affordable units. So, so that's an example of at least some current momentum in that direction that I hope we can build on. My question is there a consequence for the city, or what do you think the consequence is, of if we don't provide this funding and if we don't provide this encouragement, my assumption is that what will happen is that brownfield cleanup will start to get taken out of sale prices in the private negotiations between market rate developers and landowners, right? Which presumably could result in a lower sale price. Does that deflate property values in some meaningful way? From your business development perspective, does that have a?
I can't rule that out. As you've seen, most of the projects that come through here lately have been housing projects, and I'm not in the housing division. You might want to seek some input from some of our housing folks on that. I can say, I think more in terms of how it's going to impact the Brownfield Grant Program as a whole, because, I've had conversations with grantors about this, and some cities have gotten more restrictive in various ways. St. Paul is a good example. They've layered a lot of city requirements on some of their brownfield grants, and as a result, I think there's a $100,000 threshold. If you get that much funding or more, then there's a whole raft of city requirements that are imposed on that. And because of that, a number of grantors have either not applied for funding at all, or they've dropped their request down to $99,900. And the grantors are unhappy about that because they've got to go back to the legislature periodically to get these programs refunded. And they've said the best way to continue to get money for your projects is to have the greatest number of applications come in, to give us the opportunity to award the greatest amount of money so we can document the continuing demand for these funds, so we don't have to fight to preserve them. So their concern is that when any city starts putting restrictions on how many applications are submitted or how much money is sought, it's going to adversely affect their ability to keep these programs going and benefit other programs.
Okay, so there's a lot to think about in terms of how we would structure this.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take a shot at this. I'm going to move approval of the staff recommendation to accept item 6, parts 1, 2, and 3. And I'll take a vote on that. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item is approved. And then I'll also ask staff, I guess you'd call it a staff direction, to think through with our housing staff, but these are not only housing projects,
Sure.
How could we encourage more affordable housing when public funding is being used? Through either a mandate that they have to have something in order to apply, and what kinds of exceptions would be allowed. Just come up with something that we can discuss and talk about. And I would then urge members of the committee, if you have feedback or a point of view, to reach out to Mr. Carroll, who responds in 2 minutes to anyone who contacts him. So I would urge folks to touch base with Mr. Carroll directly, and then we can have a conversation about it prior to the spring funding round approvals. How does that sound?
It sounds great.
How does that sound to you, Councilmember Gordon?
That sounds good. I was wondering if there's a committee date when that would come back prior to those. Could we be a little more specific? The spring funding rounds, you'll come back at the end of April?
Yeah, part of the challenge is the internal deadline for my staff report for the spring round is March 30. And if, in fairness to the developers and property owners, if we're going to consider imposing some new requirements, it's always best to let them know that a bit in advance. They can take that into consideration.
So I'd suggest we come back after that round and we have the deeper discussion about what to do next time. Is that what you're kind of suggesting?
That would give us more time to work on it and fine tune it and get specifics. What I'm prepared to tell people in the meantime is that this committee and the council as a whole always has the discretion to decide which projects to allow us to submit and not submit. And I can say it's quite possible that this committee or the council is going to be taking a closer look at affordable housing requirements, and it would be prudent for you to consider incorporating that if you haven't considered doing that already.
I like that, Councilmember Gordon, because I actually think we should take a little bit more time to develop how we're going to do it. But let's see what happens when Mr. Carroll says to folks, this is a market rate deal, you might not get on the list. See what happens, and then get a sense of who applies. I think we should try to we don't even know who's applying right now. So I do think we should kind of test it out with the spring round right in front of us and work towards having a new policy for the fall round. I like that. Everyone, is there a lot of unanimity about that? Okay, so the staff recommendation as we discussed. Thanks, Irene. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item is approved. Seeing no further business before us, we are adjourned.
Thank you.